Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the another Arc session. How many of you have attended the Buckwody session this afternoon? Okay, good. All right. So I have two sessions. One right now we'll cover Arc SQL Server, and I have another session tomorrow morning. First session in the morning where we'll cover Arc SQL MI. I'll cover the differences between the two. Let's get started with the Arc SQL Server. So today what I want to cover is what is Arc SQL Server, why you should care about it, what is in it for you, and the value proposition of Arc SQL Server, and then how do you get it, like how do you onboard your SQL Server to Azure Arc. Before we get into the features and the capabilities of Azure Arc, I want to take you on some journey a little bit in the last few years. Just looking at the people in the room, I can reasonably assume you've been around for at least 10 years in the industry. I've been with Microsoft 15 years. I just turned 15 last month. And in these 15 years, I've had a chance to talk to many customers, hundreds of customers. And we released Arc Azure back in 2009. And those first 2-3 years, when I tried to have conversations with customers about Azure, I was immediately shut down. Like, no, we are not ready for the cloud. We don't know who has access to our data. Does every Microsoft employee have access to it? We don't know where it's running. Like, there's so many unknowns, so many misconceptions that people didn't even want to talk about the cloud, right? And then as we mature, say 5 years from 2010, like 2015 to 2020-ish, all the cloud providers like AWS, GCP, Azure, they have all matured. The services have matured. The IaaS, PaaS services, there's SLAs, availability SLAs, throughput SLAs. There's industry certifications around who has access to the data that the customers auditors can customers can take to their auditors. That's the acknowledge phase. The first phase is the denial phase where customers were like flat out, I don't even want to talk about Azure, right? And the second phase is where they get it, like they see the value in the cloud providers, right? And then they start playing with small applications like the legacy applications still continue to stay on-prem. Any new applications were primarily deployed in Azure, right? That's the acknowledge phase. The third one, which is the last 5 to 7 years, I would say, is when customers are fully embracing the cloud, right? Many customers have abandoned their data centers. They have gone fully into Azure or AWS or any of the other clouds, right? The other aspect of this fully embrace pattern is that customers are going to the next level and they're going multi-cloud. Not just one cloud, multi-cloud. So they have their SQL servers running in Azure, they have the SQL servers running in AWS, and even another cloud as well, right? All this sounds great. But what that brings is a whole set of challenges for the IT administrators, for the data administrators, right? Now, if I'm a DBA, I have my SQL Server on-prem, I have a SQL Server in Azure, I have some SQL servers in AWS. How am I going to keep them up to date? Like, how do I keep them consistent in terms of patching, in terms of maintenance, in terms of security, in terms of protection? Like, I have to go to different portals, I have to use different tools, I have to adopt different patterns and practices to keep my SQL servers in a consistent fashion at any point of time. This is a lot of pretty much overwhelming to any DBA, right? So this is where Azure Arc comes in. The idea and the promise of Azure Arc is that you have your SQL Server, or in general, any workload that is running outside of Azure, on-prem in different cloud. By Arc enabling that resource, you have a single pane of glass view of your resources that are outside of Azure, along with your resources that are in Azure, right? What that brings is inventory. Like, now I can go to that single pane of glass, which is my Azure Portal, and look at all my SQL servers that are running all over my estate, right? On-prem, AWS, GCP, some other cloud, in Azure, I can see them all in my single resource group view. So that's the summary of Azure Arc. So we have covered what is Azure Arc, or we'll cover that now. Think of Azure Arc as a brand. You can think about it like Office. Office is a brand, it's not a product, right? Under Office, you have PowerPoint, you have Word, you have Excel. These are the actual products under Office. So Azure Arc is something similar where it's a brand, and under Azure Arc, we have the different offerings. We have two primary categories of offerings. First one is Arc-enabled infrastructure and Arc-enabled services. There's different benefits and different value propositions in each. We'll go into that in detail. What we will cover today is the infrastructure part of it, the Arc-enabled infrastructure. You can think of Arc-enabled infrastructure as equivalent to the IaaS, infrastructure as a service pattern. And you can think of Arc-enabled services as a PaaS, like PaaS, platform as a service type of pattern. In the first one, you own and you manage and you take care of your resources. In the second one, you have a managed resource, right? Somebody else takes care of the resource for you. So it's the same pattern with Azure Arc. So let's get into the Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure category of offerings, right? Now, under this category, we have three Arc offerings. We have Arc-enabled servers, we have Arc-enabled SQL Server, and Arc-enabled Kubernetes. The idea is the same across these three offerings. You have your server, whether it's a Windows server, Linux server, or SUSE, or any of these Linux distributions. You have your SQL server that's running in a VM, whether it's a Windows VM or a Linux VM. You have a Kubernetes cluster, one of the CNCF certified Kubernetes clusters. You Arc-enable that resource, whether it's a VM or a SQL server or a Kubernetes cluster. When you say Arc-enable, what you're essentially doing is installing an agent on the host, on the resource, right? That agent projects your resource into Azure as an Azure resource. And the type of that resource will be something dash Azure Arc, right? If it's a server, it'll be server dash Azure Arc. If it's a SQL server, it'll be SQL server dash Azure Arc and Kubernetes dash Azure Arc. So this agent will project your resource into Azure as an Azure resource. So that's the theme across the infrastructure, right? Arc-enabled infrastructure. So we'll focus on the middle one, the Arc-enabled SQL Server today. And there's also benefits, right? One common benefit across all of these things is being able to view and organize your resources, right? That's a pretty powerful ability for any medium to large customer. Like I can go to 5 different people in a company and ask them, how many SQL servers do you have? And I'll definitely get 5 different answers, right? And no single person would have a good understanding of how many SQL servers are out there in a company. There is no easy way to do that. Like you have different tools that only monitor different, a subset of the SQL servers across the whole company, right? By Arc-enabling all your SQL servers, you have that single pane of glass, that single command. You can write a simple AZ command to get a list of all your SQL servers. That's pretty powerful, right? And you can have more details, like once you Arc-enable it, inventory is just one part of it, right? There's other benefits that we'll get into. So we have covered what is Arc SQL Server. We'll get into why you should care about it. What are the benefits, right? What do you get out of Arc-enabling your SQL Server? So broadly, there are 3 things that I will highlight today, and this is just the beginning of the Arc journey. We have a pretty robust roadmap for the next 2 years, like tons of features we want to add. This is just the beginning. Right? First thing is that single pane of glass view that I've been talking about, right? Just being able to run a simple easy command or go to my Azure portal and look at all the servers that I have on-prem, AWS, GCP, any other cloud, including Azure, right? Just that view of SQL servers is pretty powerful. Now, once I see the Azure, the Arc-enabled SQL Server, I can drill into it and I can see more metadata about my SQL Server. What version it is on, what's the operating system it is running on, what are the server configurations that I have set up. I can also drill into the databases that are on that SQL Server. Like how many databases do I have? Metadata about the database itself, like do I have auto shrink enabled? What's the size of the database? When was the last full backup taken? Like all the details that I can get in Arc enabling that server. The second one is under the first manage your server category is the BPA, best practice assessment. If you have attended the keynotes or the workshop from Bob, or and you have seen the best practice assessment, right? This is a tool that has some 300 plus rules that cover the industry best practices across different categories like availability, performance, server configuration, security. This tool runs against your SQL Server or can be configured to run against your SQL Server and identify any misconfigurations against the industry standard recommendations, right? And tell you if you're off and what you can do about it. And that is free. Arc enabling your SQL Server is free. BPA is free. The second thing you can do is govern these SQL servers using Purview. You can configure Azure policies and have them run against all your Arc-enabled SQL servers. That is also pretty powerful. The third one is being able to protect your SQL server. Right? You can configure Defender, Microsoft Defender, to go and assess and protect your SQL Server. Defender is constantly updated with any potential new or coming threats. So you don't have to worry about updating your Defender, right? It's already up to date. We just continuously scan your SQL Server, identify any threats and warn you, and even mitigate against those threats. The other additional benefit is the single sign-on Azure AD authentication. However, that is only available in SQL Server 2022. You probably saw this slide in previous sessions too. SQL 2022 is the most Azure connected or Azure ready database that we have today. Just across the spectrum, right? You have MI link to Azure MI. You have Synapse link to Azure Synapse. You can Arc enable your SQL Server. With 2022, Arc enabling is built into the setup. So it's part of the installation, right? And once you Arc enable, you also have the advantage of consuming additional Azure services like Purview, Azure Active Directory, Defender, like all of these become available to you. So the single view of SQL servers, I have a Azure Portal. I can show you all the things that you can look at. But the idea is you can see your SQL Server. You get an inventory. You can see what operating system it's running on. You can see which ones have what version of the CU. So you can figure out which ones need to be updated, which ones are latest, which ones are behind. You can see all the databases. You can see all the database properties. In addition to that, this is for the in-support SQL servers. Let's say you have SQL 2012, for example, which is out of support, and you're logged into that version because of some vendor application that needs to only run against 2012, right? We have a lot of customers. It's amazing to see how many people still have 2012. Simply by Arc enabling your 2012 version, you get a discount on extended support, the ESU. Arc enabling is free, and by Arc enabling, you get a straight up discount on the ESU. Maybe this is a good time to switch to the yes.
Can you enable Arc for other subscriptions? So from one subscription monitor other subscriptions?
Can you repeat the question?
So if you have, can you monitor from one subscription, Azure subscription, VMs or SQL servers on a different subscription?
So maybe this is a good time to remind, Azure Arc is for SQL servers that are outside of Azure. Okay. Anything Azure Arc is for resource that is outside of Azure. Your Arc is like a extending Azure to wherever you are, on-prem, different cloud, right? That's the idea. So your SQL Server could be running on-prem in a different cloud. By Arc enabling it, you're connecting it to Azure. So from Azure, you can see it, you can monitor it, and you can configure these other Azure services against that SQL Server, right? So that's the idea with Azure Arc. So can you all still see my screen? Okay. So what I have here is a resource group called dn-something, right? Let me go to the resource group view. So you can see that I have a bunch of resources in this resource group. Let's look at the first one, which is the server-Azure Arc. So this is the server, the Windows VM that is hosting my SQL Server. Yes? Yes, absolutely. Is that better? Thank you. So we have a server dash Azure Arc resource type. That is the Windows server that is running the SQL Server, right? When you install the Arc agent, there are two types of Arc agents. One is the server level Arc agent. If you remember, there were three boxes. First one is the Arc-enabled server. That is the Arc agent for the Windows server. The second one is the Arc agent for SQL Server, right? So you need two agents. We have work in progress to unify those two. So when you Arc-enable your Windows server, we automatically Arc-enable your SQL also, and vice versa. Even if you didn't Arc-enable your server, if you're Arc-enabling your SQL server, we automatically do the first one, right? So, but today it's a split experience. It'll be unified pretty shortly. So you have your Arc-enabled server, which is the WinDev eval something, right? It's a evaluation edition of a VM. And then you have the machine name underscore SQL Server name as the projected name. So that is a SQL Server that's running on my desktop in Redmond campus somewhere. So I have Arc-enabled that SQL Server. So I see two resources right away. One is the Windows VM, and the other one is the SQL Server itself, right? Those are the two Arc resources. And then the agent also goes and detects all the databases that I have and projects the databases also into the same resource group. So you can see I have all the system databases, right? Master, model, MSDB, TempDB. And then I also have the worldwide importers database. So it projects all the databases also into the Azure resource group. So let's look at the SQL Server and see what properties you can see. So this is the typical essentials pane, right? On the left, you have the subscription information, and on the right, you have the resource-related information. So you can see what version it is on, what edition it is, the name of the computer that's running this SQL Server, what operating system, Windows or Linux, and then the license type, right? And then I can also configure best practices to run against the SQL Server. And then I also have a databases view. So when I click on it, I can see all the databases that are running on that SQL Server. Again, remember, my SQL is not in Azure. It's outside of Azure, somewhere outside, right? I don't know. It doesn't matter where it is. So I have the system databases. I have the worldwide importers databases. So let's click on this worldwide importers, right? And then I get more information about the database itself. Again, in the essentials pane, on the left is the subscription information. On the right is the instance name. But if I scroll down a bit, I get the properties of the database itself, right? The date created, size. My VM is offline, so you will see some of these are unknowns. But if your VM is connected and online, these values will be populated. You can see information about your backups. You can see information about your correlation levels, database level settings, whether it's encrypted or not. And this is just the first level of the first set of information we started projecting, right? As we get more feedback from customers, we will add more information here. Yep, there's a question.
So does the machine have to be running to see this information? It doesn't remember from the last time it connected?
That's a good question. So the question is, does the machine have to be running to see this information? Ideally, yes. It's okay if there are periods of intermittent disconnection, right? It's not like your SQL Server is not going to be running. Your SQL is actually running and fine in wherever it is. It's just that this information is as up to date as the last connectivity.
So at some point it connected, so why can't we see the size of the database?
It probably never calculated. Like I shut down my VMs automatically whenever I'm not using them. So it might not be a good example, but it should populate. Any questions? Okay. So we have the server level view where you can see the server level information. You have the database level view where you see a lot more information about the databases. Let's switch back to the presentation. Okay, so best practice assessment. I think, assuming many of you are familiar with this, this is not a new tool. It's an existing tool that we just made available to you for free for Arc-enabled SQL servers, right? And you have all these categories in terms of security, availability, performance, and operational readiness and configuration. It checks against all of these different categories against the industry best practices, and it tells you whether you're compliant or not. And you can schedule this. You can run it as many times as you want, no charge. Defender for cloud. Microsoft Defender is one of the industry-leading security tools out there. Yes, sir. So the question is this tool for on-premises SQL servers and not for Azure SQL Server? Is that the question? I'm not sure if Azure VM has something similar. I've been more focused on the Azure Arc for the last 2 years. I don't know the Azure VM world. I have to check on that. So Defender for Cloud, you can configure Defender. Like once you project your SQL Server into Azure, for all practical purposes, it's an Azure resource, even though it's not, right? It's a type of Azure resource. And then services like Defender and Purview recognize it as an Azure resource. The Arc agent helps with the connectivity from your on-prem SQL Server to Azure. And once that connectivity is established, the Azure services can talk to your SQL Server and manage it from Azure. There's a question online.
This one doesn't seem to work.
Okay. So the question is, what method does the agent use to authenticate to SQL instances? That's a good question. I have that coming up in one of the next slides. Yep. Okay, so we talked about what is Arc SQL Server. We talked about the benefits of Arc-enabled SQL Server, inventory management, Defender, BPA, Purview, all good things, right? Now, how do you onboard to Arc SQL Server? Usually we have an architecture diagram with a bunch of boxes and lots of arrows going around. In this case, there is no architecture diagram. It's just a simple agent that you install on the Windows VM. That agent connects to Azure and all the connection happens through that agent. So there is not much of a architecture and multiple boxes to draw here, right? It's pretty straightforward. The only configuration option you have is to include an exclusion list. When you install the Arc agent at the Windows level, the Windows Server level, it projects all the SQL servers that are on that Windows VM if you have multiple instances. You can include one or more of these SQL servers into the exclusion list so that the agent doesn't project that SQL server into Azure. But by default, it recognizes however many SQL servers you have and projects all of them into Azure. But other than that, it's pretty much a simple service. If you go to your Windows services, you can see the service. If it's a Linux box, it's a daemon, right? But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward.
Do you have to manually install the agent, or is there a discovery?
Correct. The agent is a manual install once per host. Once you install the agent, it recognizes however many SQL servers you have. Yeah, I think the question is, do you have to install the agent? So if you think about it, Azure doesn't know about your SQL servers that are running on-prem. You have to connect, you have to Arc-enable the Windows server at least for Azure to know about your server, right? Once you connect, that's when you can get more information about your servers. So that first step, you have to do it, right? Yes, sir. Yep, I think that's the same question as how do you authenticate. I'll cover that in just a minute. Yep. Yep, I'll cover that in just a slide. Yep. So how do you onboard your SQL Server to Azure Arc? With SQL Server 22, it's part of the setup. So it's already built in, whether you use GUI or CMD, it's part of the setup. For older versions, you install the Arc agent manually on the Windows server and it recognizes and projects that SQL server. You can also use Azure policy to automatically detect these SQL servers, but the prerequisite to that is you have to Arc-enable the Windows server at least. Like that's the only way Azure can reach out and detect your SQL servers. You can also run scripts or automate this at scale, like using AZ commands, right? And the last one I talked about is where you, once you Arc-enable either your SQL Server or the Windows Server, we automatically do the other part, right? There's a question on screen. How about onboarding AWS RDS? Is that possible? I don't think so. It has to be a Microsoft SQL Server. I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to check on it.
So does it depend on the operating system? Because RDS is like managed instance for AWS.
Yeah, so RDS is AWS's version of managed server, right? It has to be a Windows-based or a Linux-based SQL Server for us to Arc-enable it. So when I said there is no architecture diagram, I kind of like the diagram that we see here is more of how it would look after you Arc-enable it. So there is no architecture for Arc-enabling it. It's post Arc-enabling it. How does your things look like? And this might address the connection or communication questions. So if you look at the box below, you have your SQL Server, one or more SQL Server instances on your Windows server. You have the Arc agent, which is a Windows Arc agent. You have the Arc agent for SQL Server, that's the middle one. And then you might also have other agents like Azure Monitoring Agent and all that. All these agents are communicating through port 443. You can, if you have proxy servers, you can configure proxy so that the communication goes through the proxy. But otherwise, it's all through 443. Once you Arc-enable the SQL servers and the Windows server, then you're opening your channel to Azure, right? And then you have best practice assessments. You have your Arc-enabled SQL server that will show up in Azure. You have your Arc-enabled server, which is a Windows server that will show up. You can configure Defender. Like all the Azure services will be able to reach out and communicate to your SQL server that's running in on-premises. Any questions? Okay, so in summary, we have talked about what is Arc-enabled SQL Server. We have discussed why it is important or what is the value proposition in it. Things like you can view and manage your SQL servers at scale, you can govern them at scale, and you can protect them using Defender at scale. And we have also talked about how you can onboard these SQL servers to Azure Arc, right? You can do one server at a time. You can go to Azure Portal, search for SQL Server, Azure Arc, add, it'll give you a script. You can copy that script onto the Windows server and run it in your PowerShell. That'll Arc-enable that SQL server. Or you can do it at scale. You can just script it and run it at scale. Now, in Buckwoody's session, he covered both Arc SQL Server and Arc SQL MI, and there were a lot of questions about both of these things. So in the last 1 hour, I actually prepared this slide to give you some context about what is Arc SQL Server and what is Arc SQL MI, how these are different. I'll go into a lot more depth in the Arc SQL MI in tomorrow's session, but I thought I'll at least share a high-level overview between these two in today's session. And this is a very broad overview, right? First off, the Arc SQL Server is more of an IaaS type of workload, and the Arc SQL MI is more a managed instance type of workload, right? What this means is today you continue to own and manage and take care of your SQL servers if it is Arc-enabled SQL Server. In the managed instance, similar to Azure SQL MI, you get a managed benefits. In terms of onboarding your Arc SQL Server, there is no migration needed. Your SQL Server will continue to run where it is. All you do is install this Arc agent that will do all the work. It'll project it, then you configure Defender, best practice, like all of those things. You don't need to migrate your data for Arc enabling your SQL Server. In the Arc SQL MI world, you have to first install a Kubernetes cluster, one of the CNCF certified Kubernetes clusters. Then you install the Arc data controller. Data controller, you can think of it as a control plane that will orchestrate your SQL MI creation, your provisioning, deprovisioning, scale up, scale out, like all the activities, the management activities you do with your SQL MI is done by the Arc data controller. So that's the control plane that's running outside of Azure. Once you install the Arc Data Controller, then you can install SQLMI or Postgres. Those are the two engines we have today that are Arc engines, managed services. So in the SQLMI world, it's a different type of setup. It's a Linux-based container image. So if you have a SQL Server today that you want to get past like benefits, you need to install a Kubernetes cluster, data controller, then SQLMI, and migrate your data from this SQL Server to this Arc-enabled SQLMI. So there's a migration involved. So your application will have to point to this new SQLMI. In terms of benefits, the existing Arc SQL Server, you get the inventory, you get the management, you get the protection from Defender, so all these things, right? In terms of SQLMI, there's a lot more benefits in addition to the inventory stuff, right? You get this evergreen version of SQL, just like Azure SQLMI. You get built-in high availability, you get built-in disaster recovery, built-in backups, built-in monitoring. You can scale up, you can scale down, you get rolling updates. So all the beautiful things that you have in Azure SQLMI, you get that in Arc SQLMI. The only extra step is that initial setup required where you have to go through this Kubernetes layer to install Kubernetes first and then the data controller and then the SQLMI. But once you get past that initial setup, you get all the benefits of a managed instance. In terms of billing, the existing Arc SQL Server, it's the prepaid model. There's no change to how the billing happens there. For Arc SQLMI, it's more of a cloud-based billing model where we charge you per core. In Azure SQLMI, we own the whole stack from hardware to software. In Arc SQLMI, we don't own the hardware. Like you as in customer owns the hardware, we only provide you the software, right? So there is only the software cost of it. So if you think about the pricing, it will be less than what you pay for Arc for Azure SQLMI. But there is a management aspect of it in addition to the licensing of the SQL Server. But again, the idea is it's more a cloud-based service. The billing is also cloud-like where you pay per hour. And finally, in terms of updates, we have monthly updates for both SQL Server and SQLMI. The agent gets updated every month when we add new features or new capabilities. You just update the agent and you get those new capabilities. And for Arc SQLMI, same pattern. We have monthly updates. If we release any new capabilities, new features, new security updates, you just update the SQLMI. It's a container image, so you swap out the new image and you already have the new SQLMI. And if you're using the business critical service tier, you get the rolling updates functionality, which means you have almost near zero downtime. Any questions so far? Yes, sir. So the question is, does it also install the CUs? And I'm assuming you're referring to the SQLMI. Yeah, so the monthly update that we release, it's a new image that contains security updates as well as feature updates. So it's just one update that will have everything. Correct. Correct. The MI is the managed service, right? So that's where you get all the managed benefits. For the SQL Server, you continue to install, you manage it, you take care of it. Like that's the benefit. So how do I know which one to use, right? SQLMI versus SQL Server. Simple flowchart here. So when you start out with your application, with your database workload, in general, if you can go to Azure, that's the best place. Like you have all the variety of IaaS workloads, PaaS workloads, all the defenders, and like all the Azure services. That's the golden path, if you will, if you can go to Azure. But we also fully recognize that many customers still have on-premises workloads, non-Azure, like different cloud, right? So that's where Arc comes in. Once you get into outside of Azure, you have two paths, right? If you're locked into a specific version of SQL Server, or you want to continue to take care of and maintain your own SQL servers, you don't want the PaaS benefits, or you have a dependency on things like SSIS, SSRS, ES, right? Those things don't run on Linux. So they're still Windows-only services. So if you have a dependency on any of those services, or you don't want to migrate to Kubernetes-based SQL instance, right? You can Arc-enable that SQL Server and still get some benefits. Again, we talked about those things, right? Inventory, Defender, Purview, and we are going to add a lot more benefits in the next 1 year, 2 years. But that's the path you want to go. If you're able to migrate to a Kubernetes-based SQL instance, you get more PaaS-like benefits, right? Any questions on this one? Okay. So with that, I think we're almost at the end. I have a bunch of resources, aka.ms links, the tiny URLs you can go to learn about Azure Arc. Our documentation is pretty well done at this point. Actually, I can show you the documentation. So if you go to Arc-enabled SQL Server, you can, there's a connect interactively where you can do one server at a time. Like, let's say you're not ready, you're just initially trying out Arc SQL Server. You can go to Portal, you can use the CLI or the MSI installation for Windows to Arc-enable one server at a time. Or if you want to do this at scale, once you have tried it out on a couple of servers and you want to do it at scale, we have documentation that will help you do that as well. We also have lots of documentation on how do you configure Defender, how do you configure Purview to have these policies that will manage your SQL Server. Any questions? Oh, there's a question on screen. Can you make this slide deck available? Yes, absolutely. I need to figure out where to upload my deck, but I will.
There is another from the audience online. Let me just push it.
Sorry? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. So the question on, there's a question on pay-as-you-go pricing. The pay-go model is only available for 2022, not for the older versions. Online question. What is the difference between SQL MI and Arc-enabled SQL MI? Are they the same? That's a good question. You have Azure SQL MI, you have Arc SQL MI. In theory, you should think about them as equivalent. One runs in Azure, one runs outside of Azure. The general idea is the same. You get latest updates, monthly updates, or Azure SQL MI probably updates more frequently. We have monthly updates that you have to take and update your SQL MI. It's a managed instance. It's versionless. You don't have to worry about 5-year cycles like mainstream, extended, and then you have to do a big upgrade. So you don't have to worry about all that. So in theory, most of the things are similar. Where you will see differences is Azure SQL MI is a Windows-based SQL Server at the end of the day, and Arc SQL MI is a Linux-based container image. So there is that Windows versus Linux differences that will come into play. I think that is the primary difference. There might be some features because of this Windows versus Linux that may be available in Azure SQL MI, but not in Arc SQL MI. One thing I will say is with Arc SQL MI, there is more flexibility. In Azure SQL MI, I think you have some limits on CPU in terms of disk, for example, how much storage you can allocate. With Arc SQL MI, it's completely dependent on you. Like you can, it's unlimited. You can provide however much memory you have. CPU storage, there are virtually no limits to what you can do with Arc SQL MI because you own the infrastructure. It's like running SQL Server. The enterprise edition of SQL Server, it's just managed instance. But otherwise, there's no limits of Azure. Any other questions? Yes, sir. So there's a question on performance. Both Arc SQL Server and Arc SQL MI run in your on-premises infrastructure. The performance aspect depends on what you provide to SQL Server. There is nothing from the product side. Like these things are like all the capabilities that you get with Azure Arc are outside of the engine, like management capabilities. So if SQL engine core engine has any performance improvements, you get that with the engine anyway. What we are providing with Azure Arc is things around the engine, like management, right? Backups, HA, DR. So um, we are not impacting performance. If you need, you can provision storage, CPU and memory that is required by the application. Um, So in terms of optimization, again, treat this as your on-prem SQL Server. It's no different, right? You have the BPA. If you run the BPA, it'll tell you if you're off from your configurations, right? If you haven't set your CPU or if you haven't set your memory limits, it'll tell you and you can fix that. If you have any disk lag, for example, right? You're doing a lot of scans, all those things your BPA will tell you. So the performance optimization is same. There's no difference in how you do it. It's only the management part of it, right? Yes, sir. Correct. So I have a session tomorrow morning. I think the first session 9 o'clock on Arc SQL MI. I'll go into a lot more depth. I'll skip the initial journey part. I have a ton of stuff to cover in the Arc SQL MI. We'll cover the HA, we'll cover DR, we'll cover backups, monitoring, updates, like all the things that you can do with SQL MI. I don't have anything on PostgreSQL, but the idea is we want to have it with the same level of capabilities as SQL MI. Think of the, if you go back here, so you have this data controller that is a control plane that will manage the database engines that are running on the Kubernetes cluster. And we have these two engines today. We have the SQL engine, we have the Postgres engine. With SQL, we have all these built-in capabilities, HADR. With Postgres, I think today we only have automatic backups. That's the only, Postgres is still in preview, by the way. So one of the first things we have is the built-in backups. The other things like HADR and all, we will add over time. But the idea is they will be on par, all the built-in management capabilities. Any other questions? Okay, sounds good. I think we are right about time. Cool. All right, I'll hang around if you have any questions. So thanks, everybody.